Okay. All right. So, as I was alluding to, for those who aren't familiar, this is the Neolithic axe factory here. It's approximately 60 square kilometers. Uh, every just about every exposed dike that you find in here has had human interaction, um, and there are, if you include features, there's hundreds of sites up here, uh, from cairns to structures to workshops and little intimate settings where just a couple of people are working the fell site. So the project started with utilizing Canmore, various maps, and aerial photographs to pinpoint some initial sites and to take a look at them and evaluate them and kind of get a sense of what was going on in the landscape. Over the last year, it became a little more structured and intensified, where we, using the British National Grid, divided it into the different zones. And we would walk the zones roughly 20 meters apart and crisscross back and forth to make sure that we didn't miss the features. For anybody familiar with the landscape, which the previous picture showed, it's quite harsh. It's a lot of glacial debris. There's a lot of erratics, ledges, cliffs, some deep pockets of peat in areas. When we got to some of the heavy glacial zones, which is really quite along this line here, and for about 500 to 800 meters south of this line of locks, we really had to narrow it down to 10 meters apart just to make sure we didn't miss anything. And there's no doubt that some things will have been missed because it's such an odd terrain to walk in, and it's very challenging. From there, uh, noticing that some of the sites that were coming up had things more in common with the Iron Age, I started looking at architectural typologies. And in all, in the immediate surroundings, there's 23 sites of substantial structures. And of those, I'm presenting 10 here that I marked out as very distinctly Iron Age, and it fits into a sort of phased level of interaction in the landscape. So part of the research was looking at architectural typologies Scotland-wide. You quickly realized, if anybody's ever undertaken that research, that it's very vernacular. Each region has its own distinctions. So I narrowed the scope down primarily to, but not exclusively, but primarily to a Shetland context, where we have a well-established typologies for the Iron Age, and that's thanks to excavations at Upper Scalawa, Old Scatness, and Jarlshof. So when it came to evaluating the sites, the details of the way they were built, and comparing them to sites we know about, and also doing site visits to Jarlshof and Old Scatness to look at the similarities and differences between the different sites, has really been it was the best way to go about how trying to do an architectural survey. Now, this is based on typologies that can change. Certainly, when you're doing a non-intrusive survey like the one that I've been doing, you can't answer all the questions, and all you can do is compare to what is known in the record. If that changes through intrusive methods, then so be it. I mean, either way, it would be a revelation. So the objectives I'm going to try to cover tonight is I want to show that the landscape biography of the Neolithic axe factory is far more complex than people appreciate. It was something I had run into in the beginning, where when you start to talk about structures in the Neolithic axe factory, people make the automatic assumption, understandably, that the landscape and the structures are all Neolithic. And it can be a bit challenging to try to get people to realize that there's a lot more going on in here. I'd alluded to earlier, there are two distinct phases of activity, and I'm going to talk about both of those, of course. And what should become clear, because I will talk about what is known about the sites is that there's a definite value in revisiting the antiquarian and early archaeologists' work. In this case, a lot of the work that I've evaluated has been vindicated. That in some cases has come at the expense of more modern work at the sites. And so there's a bit of a tug of war going on between the different types of work that's being done on the landscape. I also want to briefly touch on some connections to the Western Isles and show how these sites have some similarities to what we see in the Western Isles. And really the entire project is a springboard for future investigation. It doesn't necessarily have to be intrusive. And that these sites are actually on the landscape, they're quite rare and quite important. Some basic terminology. The Iron Age, I'm using the three divisions of the Iron Age tonight. There are some people who are proponents of a long Iron Age, et cetera. There's different ways of looking at it, but for me in this study, this makes the most sense, where the Middle Iron Age from 400 BC to 200 AD really is the broch period. And that as we get to the late Iron Age, we're looking at the Pictish period. And in this case, particularly from the 6th to the 9th centuries, looking at Pictish material. And that's really important. The late Iron Age in the Northern Isles has a distinct cutoff, which coincides with the arrival of the Norse. So the three ages system makes the most sense here. As far as the definition of a wheelhouse, well, in the first instance, I'm not going to dwell on Ian Armitt's classification system for complex and simple Atlantic roundhouses. Suffice to say that in the case of the first site that we're going to look at, his system of a simple Atlantic roundhouse classification for that site is the most appropriate, because what remains on the ground can't really be refined any further. I think that there is scope there for intrusive evaluation of the site to verify, but as a simple Atlantic roundhouse, you're looking at something that is Middle Iron Age or newer. As far as the wheelhouses go, Old Scatness provided, amongst the many wonderful things that excavation has given us, it gave us a much clearer idea of the wheelhouse system as it developed in the Northern Isles, and it's probably transferable to the Western Isles as well, where we start with sort of an aisled wheelhouse in the Middle Iron Age, in the later part of the Middle Iron Age, moving to a long-piered wheelhouse, if you want to call it that. And then the more traditional wheelhouse comes in the late Iron Age, where you have V-shaped piers. It's a single story, and it has a central area with the corbelled cells surrounding it. The wheelhouse definitions are going to be important here, because we're going to be looking at a couple of different sites, and this is going to be a core of the phase 1 activity. Finally, defining the fell-site interaction. One of the things that stuck out with these sites immediately was that they weren't interacting with the fell site. Defining that is fairly simple. The sites either did not have a proximity to the fell site dikes, or they did not have any fell site immediately surrounding them in the case of artifacts. A couple of the sites we did get geofacts, and so what that is that's fell site flakes that have been created by natural processes like freeze and thaw. So they fracture fairly straight, and whereas the artifacts, for instance, of an artifact of a fell site flake would have a bulb of percussion where somebody has hit a larger piece of fell site and the flake has come off. So it's actually not very difficult to discern the difference between the two. So these sites weren't interacting with the fell site. They had neither the proximity to them in most cases, nor were there any artifacts surrounding the site. So to contrast that, one of the sites that won't be talked about today, for example, is a site that probably does go back to the Neolithic or early Bronze Age, because it is completely flush with artifacts that flow out from the site into a loch, and it's roughly about 10 meters wide as it pours into the loch, just chock full of artifacts. That has a probable association with the Neolithic or the Bronze Age. So that's the starting point for that. Just a gross overview. This is another picture that shows the difficulty of the terrain. This is in the more harsher zone where we had to move to about 10 meters apart. The fell site is the origin of most of the stone tools in Shetland, and it's the only known source for the polished. This particular site here is of interest. It's not far, it's a couple hundred meters from a known workshop. It's not far from the Grut Wells Quarry, if anybody's familiar with that, or for those that are familiar with it. Here is one of the structures we found, and it's a fairly basic subcircular structure, and there's another smaller structure right here. Interestingly, I myself, for those that are familiar with the lintel gallery at the Bjorgs of Uya, I'm rather dismissive of it myself as far as its association with the Neolithic, and simply because I found them all over the place up here. Many times they're well away from fell site, and there's no fell site around them. And in fact, all these people right here are standing right in front of one. The picture's probably too small, but you can just see the lintels covering these two pieces of erratics or bedrock. So moving right on, we're looking at the first phase of activity, which I've just listed very simply as phase 1 activity, is 5 sites. It starts with Grutness, which is the simple Atlantic roundhouse, going back to probably no earlier than the Middle Iron Age. And then we'll move on to some new site finds, Hevdedale, an unrecorded site at Lang Clodie Wick, Valacames, and then I'm going to go back to Lang Clodie Wick to talk about the larger site there. These sites are all cleared landscapes, and they're likely associated with agriculture. They're separated by approximately 2 kilometers from one another, which is interesting because the phase 2 sites, the same phenomenon is occurring for most of them. There's a 2 kilometer space between them. This entire coast has been walked, and there's no other structures of any size in between the different sites, and they all are residing on the coastal edge. But that can be a bit misleading, which we'll get into in a little bit here. So starting with Grutness. Now this site is in the record. It is listed as everything from a Norse burial mound to a cairn to a prehistoric house. The estimates in size are anywhere from 6 to 14 meters in diameter. I was only able to establish an 8 to 9 meter approximation. There is a very large sheepfold and walls coming off it nearby, which undoubtedly stole the stone from here, much of the stone, and from another site nearby. So it's difficult to know exactly what the true size of this one is. It is on the coastal edge. It's not in any immediate danger, but it's not affected by tides, but it is affected by storms. And the 14-meter diameter estimate comes from a 1969 Ordnance Survey visit. Now that's 50 years ago, so much may have changed between then and now. One thing I can verify from that initial visit is that they alluded to the use of bedrock as a part of one of the walls. That does appear to be the case. It also appears that it is built into the hill. So it's revetted into the hillside in a way that we normally don't find. But beyond that, there's not much more that can be said, because what remains is so amorphous that a simple Atlantic roundhouse designation is about as much as you can say without getting under the turf. an interesting note for this and the second Grut Nest site that will come up afterwards is that they are at the end of Peddale Burn, which winds through Pettidale from Pedda Water. Pedda is an Old Norse variant for Pict, and it would seem to indicate that there's a probability that this site, the other site, or both may have been occupied at the time of the Norse arrival. And this was known as of 1897 as one of the most trow-haunted places in North Maven. So there's a very clear association with this site and the Picts. Whether this is the last refuge of the Picts or whether this is just an occupation place when the Norse arrive is unclear. But this site, that's the most that can be said about it. But it is you can see from the image here, there is some nice land surrounding it. And so the agriculture is a likely use for this site. Going to Hevedale around the coast. So we've passed Uya, which I will discuss, even though there's not much. I didn't get permission in time to complete survey at this point in there, but there's probably a little bit more going on there. So in Hevedale, we have the only thing in the record is this sheepfold that you see, and it's an omega shape with 100+ meters of wall that come off it in two directions from the entrance, which you're staring at here. However, when you look at the site on the inside, and it should be clear in this image here, because you can actually see it kind of winding around here. There's a 5 by 7 meter oval in here. Sorry, my mouse stopped working for a second. And one of the interesting things you can see is if you look at this side where it comes around, you can see the large orthostatic stones that would have likely formed the base of the wall for this oval structure. And as you come around this way, you lose them. So the structure, the main structure is here. However, behind the structure is something that's quite a bit more interesting, which is, well, in total it's 3 cells, but you've got 2 cells. You've got a cell here that's very clearly defined, and a cell here. There's a corridor, a curvy corridor that connects them. And it looks like there's an entrance here to get into this one. It's a little less clear here. And then there's another smaller cell right here. This is one of the sites that does have fell site. And the fell site is on the hillside just above. So a few hundred meters away, there's a fell site dike. However, none of the fell site that was found in this area and these exposed areas here were artifacts. It was all geofacts. So that indicated that they weren't interacting with the fell site from what we can see that's on the surface from the eroding topsoil. This curving corridor seems to connect to the larger sill because it goes right underneath the current sheepfold. One interpretation of this is you've got 2 different phases of activity. You have an oval, and we do have precedents in Shetland for ovals being used all the way from the Neolithic to the very end of the Iron Age. A recent excavation on the west side, for instance, of what was an ordinary, or appeared to be an ordinary Bronze Age farmstead, turned out to have Pictish material and architecture inside the oval. So this could just be separate structures. This could just be a Bronze Age oval here with the later addition of these structures forming one entire structure. But because you can't see the junction between the oval and these immediately behind it, you could be looking at 2 phases of building as well. So you could be looking at a Bronze Age and then a later Iron Age set of corridors and small cells. Jumping over to Valacane, so we've skipped right over Lang Clodie Wick for the moment. And this is another site that has no record. It consists of 3 main buildings here and then 2 small outbuildings on the other side of this little valley here. And the first two, numbers 1 and 2, do have the typical Bronze Age Neolithic style of oval. The second one here is actually subdivided so that you have a small cell up in here and a larger cell here with an entrance that appears to be about right here. Was of interest at this location is this structure 3. And you can see here, what you've got is you've got 2 large cells. This one, this northernmost one is quite robust. It utilizes on this side, which you can just see the edge of here, the bedrock as this part of the wall. And in the thickness of the wall tapers from about 1.8 meters at its thickest, and then it tapers down to 1 meter, which is the way the rest of it is constructed. It then has a 2-meter corridor right here, which is marked by this orthostat, which connects to another cell. And this one is a little bit, it's not nearly as robustly built, but it's an interesting site because it has almost a stripped back figure of 8 look, which was found at Buckoy with Pictish architecture in Orkney, where these sort of figure of 8 houses with the 2 connecting cells were dated to the Pictish period. So you're looking at the late Iron Age. So this could be an iteration of that. That's one interpretation. One of the things that's interesting is this is cleared land, and you see all these rifts, and this will come up when we look at Lang Clodie Wick. So you can see this is quite substantial, this rift here, and then there's 10 rifts between till you get to the coast edge. And right here where you see the circle, there's a clearance cairn, and you can see half of it's on this side and half of it's on this side. So what I believe is happening is that this land was cleared before it started to pull apart, which is just the natural geologic forces happening here. So these rifts are getting bigger, which indicates 2 things. For one, there may be parts of these sites that are missing that have already fallen into the sea. And I believe that that is going to be the case with Lang Clodie Wick. But it shows you how dynamic this area is. And, but the effort that was put into clearing it, I mean, that's a sizable clearance cairn. When you figure that this is 13.4 meters in length, this thing is probably about 18 meters in all. So that's a pretty substantial clearance cairn. But they cleared out this entire area, which, if memory serves, is something like 30,000 square meters. And it's a quite nice flat land. Moving on to Lang Clodie Wick, I'm going to deal with a second structure first that has no record in the system. This is a 2-cell structure. You can see that the northernmost cell is choked with debris. The second one, not quite so, and you can distinctly see that the wallage is here by the change in vegetation. And the cells are roughly equal, 2-meter internal diameter. This could be a Bronze Age oval. It could be yet another iteration of the figure of 8 building, and it could very well just be an outbuilding. There's not enough on the surface to say with any certainty exactly what it is. The only evidence of field walls for this site are upslope, and it's a mere 10-meter section that then takes a turn, a 90-degree turn for another couple of meters. There's nothing about the wall that tells you anything about the age, but it is at the base of the steepest part. Lang Clodie Wick is a very interesting, if you imagine a cereal bowl cut in half, that's essentially what you're looking at with Lang Clodie Wick. So you come down very steep sides, and then it gradually tapers out to a nice flat area, but it's extremely rocky, very, very thin soils. So that's where we're going to go now. So Lang Clodie Wick, this is a site that's in the record. and it is listed as a prehistoric house. They compare it to Fetherland, and which then gets compared to Cafa Vide, which was a Calder excavation in the 30s in Orkney. So these are just basically thought to be predecessors to brochs. They're the simple Atlantic roundhouses. However, I believe that the evidence that this is a wheelhouse is overwhelming. In fact, I think that it's not just a wheelhouse, it's a large wheelhouse, and it is very much intact. So if we take a look through the pictures, this is thanks to Vivian Clark, who I saw was who was here today. He tramped through a lot of these areas with me and did all these wonderful drone images. So you see the wheelhouse here, of course. So it's 14 meters in diameter. And here it is looking at it from the side. I think one of the things that potentially fools people with the site, those that have visited it and looked, is that perhaps they're not quite grasping what they're seeing. So what I want to point out is that if you look at here, and then you look down here, you have a 1.5 meter drop. So down here where the entrance is, and there is a intact corbelled cell here that does not have its cap on it. But down here where the entrance is 1.5 meters lower than here. What's actually happening here, I believe, is that you are walking on top of intact cells. So I think this wheelhouse is primarily intact. And I'll move on to the next picture, because here you have one of the cells, and you can see where it's collapsing now. Just off camera here, you can see where the upper part of a pier has just collapsed downwards. But here you can see the stone sticking up at a 45-degree angle as gravity pressures to push it downwards, with a very large capstone here. But you can see there are little crevices and stuff. You can just kind of peek inside and try to see what's going on. So, you know, why is the site so well intact if it is indeed a wheelhouse? I think because these coastal sites are misleading. Grutness is the only site that actually has access to the sea. These sites from Heavdale to Lang Clodie Wick to Valacames should be considered inland sites. You can see the size of the cliffs, and the next image will show it even better. They have no access to the sea. And for Lang Clodie Wick, its closest access to the sea is at Uya, 4 kilometers away. So the incoming Norse would have had little interest in this site because it's so remote. And even for today, for the hiker, it's remote. It takes a couple of hours to get out there, and that's if you don't get distracted by the fell site. So it's protected by its remoteness, and also for the incomers, it just didn't serve any purpose for them. So it was pretty much just left alone. That's great for us, because I think that there's a huge amount to be gained from studying this. But even if it turned out to not be a wheelhouse, at the very least, it is a substantial roundhouse, at the earliest going back to the Middle Iron Age. So I want you to take a look at the wider environment here as to what's going on. I talked about the Valacames rift. Well, here you can see the land is quite active as well. You can see the different rifts here, and this one is very, very deep. If you look back here, you can see that it continues to fall away. This, of course, is a much more recent collapse. I couldn't tell you when, but you can see that this is has much greater weathering here, and this is much fresher. So the place is continuing to collapse. And I think that one of the things to take from that is that we may have already lost some interesting information that this site would have provided, because I have a hard time imagining that you would build something this large, that close to a sea edge, especially if you had visible signs that it was collapsing. So I think that there was a lot more to this site than what we currently know. But to put it into some context, you take a look at Old Scatness with Structure 6, which they rebuilt, they reconstructed a model of the wheelhouse, and it was a small wheelhouse, and it took 780 man hours to build. This wheelhouse would be about twice the size, so it's going to take a lot more effort. Not as much as a broch, mind you, but it's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a lot of people to build this. And so putting it close to the sea edge like that is improbable. When you go just north, and it's one of the things that they do mention with the OS visit in 1969, is that for 400 meters north, there's a lot of clearance. In this immediate area, there's practically none. But when you get a couple hundred meters away to the north, you can see that this whole area has been cleared. These soils are exceptionally thin from what we see today. But the clearance cairns are interesting. So you take a look here, you've got a couple of exceptionally large clearance cairns, and then they take a 90-degree turn and they come across this way, which cleared out this whole area. They're so large. The largest one is 15 meters long, 5 meters wide, and a meter high. And you can see just here, you can see where the debris coming off the steeper hillsides is starting to come down. So I almost wondered if the clearance cairns didn't serve two purposes. It wasn't just to clear this area, but it was to keep the heavier stone debris from filling back into this area. I had reached out because I couldn't quite grasp what the underlying geology would mean for agriculture in this area, because I had a hard time discerning whether they would have been practicing pastoralism or arable agriculture. Basically, the soils would have been acidic. We know they're thin from what we can see now, so they likely would have been exhausted rather quickly unless they were enhanced. So to get into a quick discussion about it, they are 2 kilometers from one another, roughly speaking, the thin, easily depleted soils. That is what we see today. Uy is going to be a little bit different, and I'm going to consider that in a second. These should be, as I said, considered inland sites because only Grotness has immediate access to the sea. One of the things that brings into question, and I would love to have a wider economics discussion, but we've got one of two things happening here, and it's very basic. Either the sea resources aren't as important as we have previously thought. Now, the vast preponderance of sites that have been excavated up to now have been on coastal sites. And so are we making assumptions based on coastal sites? When we reach non-coastal sites, is it going to be completely different? I don't know that that's the case. What I think is going on is if you went back and looked at some of the economic models for the broch here, like Noel Foyett spent a lot of time working on that. I think what we have is probably a localized economy. Maybe it extends Shetland wide, but I think you've got a localized economy where whatever is going on at Lang Clodie Wick, they are potentially trading for resources that they don't have access to. The land itself is probably not good for much beyond the most subsistence of crops. So, and grazing wise, although the coastal area is the most fertile, it's questionable how much you're going to be able to graze on this type of land. The Hevedale and Ballacane sites, I think, are quite clearly multi-period. As I had alluded to, the oval structures have a currency from the Neolithic all the way through the end of the Iron Age. So it wouldn't be a surprise to find that they had been utilized all through that time period. One of the other aspects to that I think is important is that if you look at the site of Lang Clodie Wick, regardless again of whether it's a wheelhouse or not, it is a substantial roundhouse. And for it to be built in what we view looking at the land today, for it to be built in the least hospitable of all of these lands, indicates that these are likely occupied at that time as well, because otherwise it just feels like you would naturally put it somewhere else where you have a much better quality of land and for grazing or for planting. The pedicites, as I talked about, and I'll get to again in phase 2, is fairly important because it does show that there's some sort of interaction going on there. So the one weakness in the whole chain is Ouya. So I want to just very briefly talk about Ouya. So I didn't get the permission because these buildings, you can see this area is still utilized, and I didn't get permission in time to really get in close to these and take a look at what's going on. So I utilized some old maps. This term here, which I'm just going to pronounce as Kummel, there is no Ordnance Survey definition for it. In fact, it almost appears that it only shows up on the survey maps for 1882 and 1902 for Shetland. But what's interesting about this term, it's the font indicates that it's something of antiquity. And you can see here, there is some sort of a circular structure. Now, at the time, they generically called it a cairn. But if you look at some of the other sites, so you take, for instance, Stanydale, for example, was listed the same. And we know what, of course, we have at Stanydale Temple. But one of the things I discovered in my research was in 1968, they examined 9 of these sites in Shetland, and they recategorized 8 of them as Neolithic Bronze Age houses. So there's a very good chance that what we have going on in Ouya, there's a large structure here, which if this picture is clear enough, it's a bit misleading because you just tempted to put that box right in here, but that's not quite the case. There's a wall that comes out here. It's right here, roughly, is where that site is. I think this would be perfect for some geophys, even just getting there and probing the ground a little bit to see if there's some definition left, because I have a feeling that there's going to be something underneath this field. So Ouya is the most profitable land in that area, bar none. And when you consider that when the Norse arrived, and there's plenty of evidence from the Western Isles to Orkney to here, that they occupied previously utilized land, a large township, village, however you want to term it, had grown up in Ouya. It supported, as of 1900, there were still 6 houses that were occupied here. So the land is obviously rich enough to provide for a number of houses. If we look back at the old Scatness, the Environs project, and the work they did looking at soils immediately around the old Scatness broch, and then in the environment and around the different brochs, is that you discover that during the Iron Age, they were doing a lot to enhance the soils and keep them productive. And this is something that I suspect had been going on at Ouya prior to the Norse arrival. They probably came into a rather substantial set of buildings, substantial site of some kind, and they just simply sat on it and utilized the previously enhanced soils. So I think that's what's going on at Ouya, but it is an area that I need to get into and take a closer look. Moving quickly on to phase 2 activity. We're going to again start at Grutness, and we're going to go down to the Giant's Garden, Burner Water, out to Birkawater. And these are all very strongly Pictish. So Grutness multicellular site, the first site that we're going to look at. This one is interesting because in the record, you've got on the 1902 map, you have a sheepfold, and the 1969 visit lists 4 subrectangular buildings, likely of more modern origin. I visited this site years ago and always felt that that was just dead wrong. It's definitely not what was going on here. So with the help of Vivian Clark and getting the drone images, there's as many as 11 cells, and it's organized around structure 1, which is this one, and structure 2 here. Structure 1 has an 8-meter internal diameter, double skinned walls with a rubble core interior, certainly not subrectangular. If you look closely at the picture, you can see, and it's more obvious in the next picture, but you can see that you can see the trail of debris of these large basal boulders. And you can see here, you can't be fooled by this later addition of a wall. You have to look a little more closely, and you can see that there's an adjoining wall between the two. Whether they communicated internally or not, I have no idea. It's quite dilapidated at this point, but you can very clearly see the large structure. When you look at the oblique view, you can make out the debris field much more clearly. So these are two connected large buildings. This one here has about a 6-meter in internal diameter. Now I've put here in the notes V-shaped piers. Well, interestingly enough, and I will admit that I've spent hours at this site, and it does take a while to get your eye in, and you really have to sort of visually pick through the collapse. But you can very distinctly make out in this one here V-shaped piers inside here. And you can also make it out just inside some of this area here. So this looks like it has an architectural feature of V-shaped piers, which would put it in the late Iron Age, and would actually mean that what we might have are two conjoined wheelhouses, but in particular, this one more likely. If I've planned it right, I have. So here is a scaled rough sketch of what these sites look like. So it's turned a little bit on its side for you, but you can see that what we have are two very substantial structures with a different type of wall makeup than what we're going to see with a lot of the other Pictish structures. But they have little entrances that come out to small cells and here and into structures here. South of it, there are some rubble core, what looks like they're just circles of rubble core, 3 in particular. I had mentioned earlier about the sheepfold at the other Grut Nest site. And here we have what I think are more substantial cellular structures that have been robbed of the larger stone. And that's why we're left with these little tiny circles of what would be rubble core interior. So if that's true, we do have a great number of structures here. But importantly, we may have yet again another wheelhouse. Moving to the Giant's Garden, again, fascinating site. It's built in a glacial debris field. It is at least 20 semi-subterranean structures, cells connected by low lintel passages. The preponderance of them are up in here. This seems to be, or this is on the surface, the core. The enclosure that you're seeing here is of a later date. The obvious way to know this is that, especially down in this section, but even up in here, it goes over other cells. So the cells are predating this enclosure. Now, this is one of the sites that was excavated by Robert Monroe, a one-day excavation in 1902. He had come up at the behest of the landowner, and he excavated these cells in here, and it's basically been left untouched since. It was unclear to him whether these were corbelled cells. I think that he missed his opportunity, in particular with the fact that this cell right here, which is cell 2, collapsed when two children were bouncing on the top. They collapsed the roof. So it was clearly an intact cell before they started bouncing on it. Some of these other ones, there's other cells around here that are still intact, and it's unclear exactly what's underneath them. What became most astonishing here is through the course of this late spring, early summer landscape survey, is that we really didn't get a whole lot of rain this year, so land began to sink. And lo and behold, what popped out was a much larger structure that's here in the middle. Now you can see the definition here of it. Now the next picture will show it as well, which is connected to these set of structures by a 5-meter square hump. So there's something else going on in here that connects to a much larger structure here in the middle. And you can see that here. You can see this nice line of vegetation change. And probing, sometimes with no more sophisticated a tool than a meat skewer, you can kind of get the wall edges. So we have a large structure here. Some of the cells that they didn't excavate are in here, over in here and here. This one is a bit of a contention. This is either a corbelled cell, or my favorite interpretation is that we'll see a picture of the walls in a minute, but there's a large amount of small granite debris in here. And my hunch, which it could be dead wrong, my hunch is that they were creating gapping stones in here. So they were knocking bits off of the red granite to get the smaller stones to fill the gaps in the walls that they were building. The walls are primarily single skinned. It's built into the hillside. It's built into the ground. This site has an enormous difference in levels between cells. And the next site we'll talk about that a little bit more. Another interesting feature is the use of glacial erratics, which some of the cells have done, and using landscape features in general. So here's a picture of the wall. Now this is part of the excavation, presumably anyway, from Monroe in 1902, but down here we can see where the wall's still intact. It might be a little bit difficult to fully grasp. So this is cell 2, the one that the children had collapsed. But the picture's a little bit hard. It's hard to tell a 3D story in 2D, but you can see that the wall is tapering inward, so that there was at least a partial corbelling going on here, and you can see the little gapping stones and the quality of the work. Most of the sites up here in these Pictish style buildings are built with large, in excess of a 0.5 meter red granite boulders as a base course, with smaller boulders working their way up. When you look at the Pictish sites, structures at Upper Scalawa and Jarlshov and Old Scatness, most of the small cellular structures we associate with the Picts that we find elsewhere are edge set stones. They're built into midden, or they're built into the fabric of crumbling or existing buildings. Up here, we don't really have adequate. Red granite isn't going to fracture like a flagstone. So the most efficient way would just be to use the large orthostatic sized boulders as your base course and start to build up from there. Moving on to the next site, Burn of Roarwater. Now, this one is one of my favorites up here. The only excavation that happened was the landowner doing this cell 1 here. You can see there's actually 2 glacial erratics that are used. And if you look really closely, and the picture isn't too small, you can see one low lintel passage curving off this way, and you can see another one heading this way where the ranging rod is. This one is embedded deeply into the hillside, very, very semi-subterranean. The walls are most often single skin, and the elevation drop from here down to here, so this is cell 8, that's cell 9 down there, but cell 8 is 2.75 meters. So basically they've got a cell lintel passage to slightly lower leveled out area. You've got a cell and a cell, and it goes lower and lower again. So this oblique view, it shows you, gives you a pretty good idea of the land dropping. Over in here is a cluster of many, many more cells. So you've got 9 very distinct cells here, and several more over here that are covered in turf and in heather. Because this was non-intrusive, I did not pull back much, of anything out here, just enough to see if there was some walling going on to verify that there's a cell, and indeed there was. But otherwise, of course, no excavations took place to verify how many cells there might be. We did do a tape and offset drawing here, and so I've compared it side by side with this drone image, and you can see The red arrows are the lintel passages that are very visible, and the little gray stones are lintels themselves. So you can see that all these little cells are connected to one another. This is very reminiscent of Pictish architecture. There really is no other period in my architectural review that has this type of semi-subterranean structure with low linteled passages connecting the cells. So it's hard to get beyond that typology. It's hard to get beyond the fact that these are very much Pictish, sort of 6th to 9th century structures. It's also much like the Grut Nest site. It seems to be organized around a couple of large cells. So in this case, the whole thing is organized, it seems, somewhere around cell 5 or cell 8. And all these other cells are smaller. And this became an important aspect that I went to Old Scatness and Jarlshof to try to look at, because there's a lot made about the loss of communal space as we move through the Iron Age and we get into sort of the Pictish period of the Iron Age. I'm beginning to wonder if it's maybe not slightly overstated, that we may actually, what we might be looking at is a reorganization of space. It's something worth looking deeper into and testing. But some of the interiors of these cells that it's being organized around, they're not really smaller than the interior of, say, an average sized wheelhouse, if you could call something average sized. But these few meters in diameter is really all you're going to get between the piers. So have they really lost the communal space, or are there other reasons why they're building these small ephemeral structures? Anyway, moving on to roar water. Now this one is interesting because, okay, so like the Giant's Garden and the Burner Roar Water, the two sites we just discussed, and this site here, there's a bit of a problem going on. So for the OS survey never found Burner Roar Water or the Giant's Garden in 1969. The previous site that I was just showing you, the Burner Roar Water, basically has dropped off the record until recently when we got in there and rediscovered it. They couldn't find it, and there's no other reports of it. So its Canmore record actually is more than a kilometer away from where the actual location is. So, but the Roar Water site was excavated twice, once by Monroe in 1902 and then again in 1904 by Abercrombie. This one has an absolute multitude of these low lintel passages. In fact, there's 4 of them coming off of this central cell. And you can see there's one that curves off this way. This heads off to cell C. This one heads off to cell, what I'm calling 6, and this one heads off to this cluster of cells. This picture on the right is just the interior sketch of the different cells, and this is from Abercrombie's 1904 excavation. So it's just the internals, which is why you don't see all the nice, pretty little stones. And so that's why some of these cells have letters, because it's corresponding with what they have going on here. And I don't think that there's an actual different a D here. But nonetheless, they hinted towards the fact that there was more cells here to the west. They kind of showed a little curiosity, but I guess that's enough of a handful to excavate. But they did notice that these lintels were here and that the passages were choked with stone. Because of the land contracting, the lack of moisture, it was very easy to see subsurface stone, the cells, subsurface cells in these areas. In fact, this one is quite a large cell. Again, we're seeing glacial erratics being used here, here, and over in here. And this little thing it's an actual wall. This is just the very top of it. So there's a wall here with a connecting passage between these glacial erratics to this large cell here. So you're looking again at a clustered site organized around a large cell. It does have a meter drop from here to what can be found here. So that was basically driving a ranging rod in as deep as we could go to see if we could reach a natural floor layer. And so unscientifically, and that's why it's approximately like a meter drop. So there is a slight elevation change between all these cells as well. And it is just 100 meters from the loch shore at Water. The northern half of it is built into the hillside, and the southern portion is just on the natural level of this small valley. Getting a look at some of the interior of this cell F, and you can see this passage going off here, a collapsed lintel, and the passage going off to cell C. So measured the passages. They range from 1 meter to 1.9 in length. They're very small, up to 0.9 meters in height, and a half a meter to 0.7 meters wide. So these are very narrow passages. Interesting with this site, one of the features that we see that we didn't see at some of the other sites is you see this little cupboard here. I mean, it could be a door bar, although this is just an interior passage, so I'm not sure. But anyway, there's 2 cupboards in this site, and one of them is right here, just beyond the ranging rod, and the other one is located, because that one would be right in here, and the other one's located right down in here. Finally, we get to Water. This one is really interesting. So in 1967, there was a local report of structures underneath a cliff. In 1969, they didn't find it, and there's pretty much been nothing in the record ever since. Much like Lang Clodie Wick, and probably owing to sort of the location preservation, this site is many, many cells. It's absolutely enormous. It's 60 by 20 meters in area. I chose just the one image to show you here. It does seem to be organized around this cell here, which may still be intact. And it appears there's a lintel passage that connects to these, and this is a series of 7 corbelled cells of various stages of collapse, but mostly intact. So what I can tell from these is that these were fully corbelled stone from top to bottom. You can look inside and you can see the little lintel passages connecting between them. For all intents and purposes, if you were to just stare at it from the top of the cliff, which is about 10 meters above, you would just see like a half a wheelhouse. They don't appear to abut the cliff, however. They do appear to be just off of it. There's a lot of use of glacial erratics in the area. This is another area that has very poor soils. There's nothing arable about it, but you can see there's 2 cells here, and there's a glacial erratic just here. There's a there's a group of 4 cells just to the southwest of here, and then there's another nice, really large cell up here. This one also may have suffered from some stone robbing, because there is a large sheepfold with a lot of walls that is about 40 meters this way. And so some of the peripheral cells may have been robbed for that, but the area that it stretches over and the deepness of the peat here, I suspect that there's a lot more that's not being seen on the surface. Some of this stuff became more evident, again, with the contraction of the land in the later visits. But again, it's a very semi-subterranean, built into hillsides, and utilizing large boulders as a base. So finally, the phase 2 discussion. For these sites, and I've chosen this map, so I wanted to show you real quick. So this basic heat map is the health and, let's say, density of the vegetation cover. So the deeper the red, the higher quality and the more dense the vegetation. So you can see our sites like Ouya is just glowing. Our site here at Grotness, some nice land there. We moved to, let me see, right here is Hevdedale. Valakames, unfortunately, is off, and Lang Clodie Wick is right here. But you can see that there's quality land of a sort through these areas. When you get to these Pictish structures, and you can see the blues, I mean, this is an absolutely terrible, terrible land if you were trying to grow anything. So it's a real mystery as to what's going on at these sites. They are about 2 kilometers apart. This is about 800 meters from here to here. So this one's a little bit closer. But yes, so they're remarkably uniform in the way that the sites are laid out and the type of architecture that's used. They're all built within at different elevations. They utilize hillside revetment, unworked base stones. 4 of the 5 sites are semi-subterranean, and they're built in debris fields, which is most peculiar. So in the hierarchy of choice, it seems that the ready availability of stone seems to be from what we can see today, seems to be the primary consideration. And they are all of definite Pictish typologies. And I would say that if you were to look at the chance of them being contemporary with one another, your highest chance is that these are contemporary. There's probably crossover with what's going on the coast to some degree, but these are highly likely to be contemporary with one another. Grutness, however, is slightly different. As you could tell, it's the only coastal site. It has subjectively a higher quality of architecture with the double-skinned walls, the rubble core interior. It is a bigger structure. The main structure, 1 to 8 meter diameter, is a much bigger structure than what we're finding in some of the other ones. So there's something slightly different, but the site layout is the same. Follows a lot of the same principles as all of these Pictish sites. And there is some step down nature to the site. So it isn't all built on the same level. It does step down to different levels. So what does it all mean? Well, of course, in a very basic way, we've got 3 to 4 new sites, depending on how you want to catalog it. We've reevaluated and reinterpreted 5 sites, and 5 late Iron Age multicellular Pictish settlements, 4 are semi-subterranean. And I will back up for a second, because one thing I wanted to mention with the Roarwater site, if you remember, that was the one with all the lintel passages. That is a scheduled site. Now, they scheduled as a prehistoric house, kind of indeterminate what exactly it is. But some of the characterization is a bit off. So I disagree. Well, I agree with the scheduling of it. I disagree with the details of the scheduling. I do believe that the evidence is there that this is a multicellular site. It is not an oval with a couple of outbuildings and surrounding field walls. It's very clearly, it harkens back to what Monroe and Abercrombie determined, which is that this was a multicellular site. They were really kind of looking for beehive sites because they were chasing a certain type of site. I think they actually kind of found it, but didn't fully realize what they had found. One of the interesting things is a consideration of how these were roofed. Now, we saw with Water that it was corbelled all the way to the top. And we see at Lang Clodie Wick, we see the intact corbelled cells. With the semi-subterranean nature of them and the revetment into hillsides, I think that the description, some Norse descriptions of the Picts living in little underground holes, is kind of accurate in the sense that these were probably, or there's a good chance that these were turf clad. And if you were coming upon them, they would look like little holes in the ground. So it would look like people were retreating into these little hovels. So I think that there's honestly a grain of truth to that particular one. Now, I alluded to earlier about the Western Isles. What is interesting here is that, so within a Shetland context, what do we have? In Shetland, all of our wheelhouses that we have up to now are freestanding, and with the exception of Robins Brae in the South Mainland, are known around brochs. Lang Clodie Wick not only would be a second standalone wheelhouse, but it's semi-subterranean. So it is very reminiscent of, say, for instance, in the Outer Hebrides, where they build wheelhouses into the macaire. So it's there. While all of ours have to this point been freestanding, this is actually built into the hillside. If it's sustained with the Grut Ness SAR, then you might have yet another one that's built into a hillside. The Grut Ness, if the larger one is a wheelhouse, then you have yet another freestanding wheelhouse. But this time it's not built into a hillside, but it's another standalone wheelhouse. And one of the ones that didn't come up in this conversation is yet another wheelhouse that was found. So this study has found, in my opinion, at least two wheelhouses and potentially four. So we've got many more wheelhouses to look at now that are away from the brochs. With the Pictish structures, if you look at the way that they are organized and you look at the way that they are built on different levels, there is parallel again with the Western Isles. So for instance, if you look at the Amazon's house on St. Kilda, it is very much set up in much the same fashion that these are, with the organization around a larger cell. So we may have some connections with the Western Isles in evidence here, and that would be something as well. But the Pict settlements themselves, regardless of connections elsewhere, the only ones that we have so far in Shetland are around the brochs. So this potentially gives us 5 new sites of standalone Pictish settlements. So little Pictish communities that are tucked away, and we haven't had the chance to study these before, absent a broch. So there's every possibility that they're going to tell us something completely different. It's going to be a completely different story. And in the case of these ones up here, the one caution is that it's difficult to know how typical they are, because this landscape is very forbidding. Why they built them in here when they clearly couldn't run cattle in here, you couldn't get much out of the land planting wise, is still a bit of a mystery. So they may not be typical sites. They may be completely atypical. And I believe that's the end. So if anybody has a question, now's a good time to ask. It's a lot of information that I threw at you. And so just remember to unmute yourself if you have a question that you wanted to ask.
Steve, several of us clearly interpreted your CUML as TUML, a tumulus, or the plural tumuli. Have you a view on that?
I do have a view on that. I spent T and C are very similar to one another. And so I had spent, I want to say, almost the better part of an hour comparing the way the letters were written. And the conclusion I came to is it very clearly is a C and not a T. And so I'm going to stick with that interpretation, because I had a hard time with that myself, and really kind of went out of my way to try to figure it out, because I don't like puzzles that I can't solve.
To take on that, Steve, can I go with the middle ground of that? If it is a C, it still could be cumulus, which is a heap.
I'm sorry, which is a what?
A heap.
Yes.
A cumulus could be a heap.
Yes.
So you could get cumulus as a mound, I guess, rather than tumulus.
Yes.
So it's like a halfway house between the two interpretations.
And I think that that's exactly what it is. I was really surprised to find that the OS, and I found their glossary of terms, which was hundreds and hundreds, and there was nothing. It was the only thing I couldn't find a definition for.
One set of map makers have just come up with their own term.
Yeah, just, you know, but it was more the kernel of what was happening there is that when you get to the other sites in Shetland, that they had reinterpreted them. Of course, this one gets wiped out in like early 1900s. So there was no way to go back and reevaluate that particular site.
Hello, I'm in here, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're speaking about Commel. That's a Shetland word, and it's a term we would use for putting something upside down. So we would Commel something over is to put it upside down, and probably you would have a mound shape, whatever it is. There's a site near where we live in West Boreford called Commel Yard, and it's a more modern building now, but there's a lot of ancient buildings there, but it's called the Commel Yard.
Interesting. Well, thanks for that.
I would go with the C rather than the T.
That's really interesting. And if it was dialect, that might explain why it's nowhere else.
Well, that's what I was about to say. Yeah, I mean, that would explain why I'm only seeing it on the Shetland maps and I'm not seeing it on other OS maps.
Yeah, so if you Commel something over, you turn it over, and you can almost imagine it to be sort of mound shaped or round shaped once you do it. So it's to me it makes perfect sense.
Good.
If something's a Commel of stains is just exactly what we're looking at when you were showing us all your pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And as I'm saying, there's actually a near where we live called the Commel Yard.
Yeah, so you would think, therefore, that there was probably there was something there, something circular, something quite large, enough to have been noted as a feature anyway, and a feature of that type of Commel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I would definitely go with the C rather than the T. That's just how I would think about it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Well, while anyone else is thinking of questions, I'll just have a look in the chat, and we've got one other comment popped up that's not to do with the Commel, which is that Oyer and Heaverdale are bright with vegetation because they've recently been reseeded.
Mm-hmm.
So you may find there's recent improvements kind of influencing the quality of ground there, I presume.
This is true. I mean, it's still worked land, but if you I tried to look at it historically and contextually. So, for instance, in 1822, when Hibbert is touring Shetland, he describes Uya as the most profitable grazing land in North Maven. So it clearly, in 1822, it was very rich, and it's more by inference than anything else that the size of the village that grows up at Uya and the penchant for the Norse to build on top of Pictish structures and utilize Pictish sites with their enhanced soils indicates to me that there's a high, I don't want to say probability, a high chance that this was an occupied site by the Picts, could have been a substantial site where they had been enhancing the soils already. I see we've got Val here, and I'm not putting her on the spot, but she did a lot of the environs work around Old Scatness, so she knows considerably more than I about plague and soils and the improvements that they were making during the Iron Age. I suspect that we might have gotten some indication. I mean, you'd have to take soil samples, but an indication that there's a good chance that this is what was happening at Uya as well.
Yes, around Scatness, you've got soils that in the Pictish period were about a metre deep with all the additions that they were putting into the land. So they were doing it really, really heavily, which I would be surprised if that was the case in any of the sites that you showed us. But as you say, there's only one way to find out, and that's to put sections through it and have a look and see what they were doing. Could I also say, while I've kind of pinched the microphone, first of all, I'd like to say what a fantastic piece of work this is, Steve. And to really thank you for that, because it's really kind of added greatly to what we know and what we think about Picts. And the second thing is to add to your corpus of Pictish sites, I think, with Gungstee, Nos, which I excavated in 1994. We became quite convinced that what we were looking at was the base of a round towered chapel, but fortunately, perhaps I was stopped from, by skeptics, stopped from publishing that idea. And I think on reflection, and in the light of what we know about what we then, fairly soon after that, in fact, found at Scatness, and comparing it to what we just dug up at Gungstee, and the fact, and some of the artifacts that we found as well, I think that there's no doubt about it that we've got another Pictish site there.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, they're there, and you know, I'd alluded to some work on the west side where a Bronze Age, what was thought to be a Bronze Age house, surprised by throwing up Pictish artifacts and stuff. And you see with Calder's excavations at Stanydale, there was some Iron Age mucking around in there as well. So I think that, you know, there's always been this, where are all the people in the Iron Age, you know. I think that a lot of these Bronze Age farmsteads were probably being utilized. And then there's also the luck of preservation, not just these sites up in North Roe being preserved because of their location, but I think it was Noel Foyett and, well, maybe even Valid pointed it out as well. But that depending on how they were roofed, you know, if you're looking at these little semi-subterranean structures, they're easily missed. And and if they're using timbers to partially roof these things and they're already insubstantial, it's easy to plow them under. And so there's probably some other sites that have been lost and, you know, due to agriculture as well, but or they're just, over time they've collapsed down. You don't see much left on the surface.
Hi, Steve. Have you surveyed the whole area south of Roe water as well?
I'm sorry, if I explored the whole area.
Have you surveyed the whole area south of Roe water?
Yes, for the most part, yeah.
Yeah, many years ago, shortly after I first arrived in Shetland, I was wandering over there and found an intriguing structure on top of a ridge, pretty much due south of the outflow there, which consisted of a circle of stones with a lintel lying across a natural cleft in the rock, which I reported to Historic Scotland. And Noel Foyt's comment was, "It looks like he's just built that." I just wondered if you found that one, because unfortunately I didn't have a GPS machine at the time. So,
well, how big was the structure, would you estimate?
It would probably be about 3 meters diameter, the circular thing.
As I alluded to in the introduction, there's a lot going on up there for features. Even if you get away from workshops and everything else, just for stone features, they're in the hundreds. One of the things that I came across a lot of, and it is sort of still a mystery that bugs me, are these corbelled cairns. So some of them are extremely large, and they're not mead points. They're not navigation points for getting lost in the fog. I mean, some of these are really substantial, and they're hollow. And it wasn't until Vivian Clark and I were at Lang Clodie Wick that I discovered that one of these really large, that had an external diameter of probably a couple of meters, one of these large cairns was actually modified from a almost kist-like structure. So one thing I didn't talk about at the Lang Clodie Wick picture is there's a box-like structure to the left of it that's very obvious. I don't think it's associated with the wheelhouse, but whatever it is, this substantial cairn was modified out of yet another of these rectangular things. it could be what you found was one of those. Did you say you had coordinates?
No, I hadn't, unfortunately. I've been back a couple of times to try and track it down again. I must try harder next time.
The other problem that you come across when you get to that area is the was it 1976 or 78 NATO exercises?
Oh yeah, no, this is well away from that area.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll just have to chalk that up with a question mark then, because I'm not.
I did take several photographs. Unfortunately, I gave most of them to Historic Scotland. I haven't seen them since.
Oh no.
I have one which might help me to track it down again.
Well, that's one of the good things about digital photography these days, isn't it? But no, if I happen to, it's funny because I had Saturday pegged to go and look at a couple different sites, and there was an area just off of Colliforth I was going to be going to. Now the weather's turning bad again, so I'm not sure I'm going to get there. But
well, if I track it down again, I'll let you know.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, because like I said, I'm really kind of looking at this as phase one of a, at some point I have to hand in a report on all of the sites, which includes the Neolithic sites, other little farmsteads, just every little anomaly so that we have it in the official record. But it's challenging because you do run into so many things there that if you tried to, for instance, categorize every cairn, you'd end up with a giant blue dot all over the axe factory. So many of them.
Well, just going back to the chat again, Karen has asked, which I think probably a lot of us want to know, is what's the next step for your research?
Well, strangely enough, one of the things I just discovered recently was within my budget was a wall bore camera. So what I'd like to do, because I'm not qualified to lead excavations. I can do at most a clean and record, like we do, Esther. But this wall bore camera would be interesting because with the 2 meter length cord, I can put it into all these little holes and corbelled cells and get it in there and get some images of what's going on inside. And that's actually, quite frankly, the next step for me is to do that. But I'd love to organize some, I know that there's ongoing work up there on taking soil samples already. And I had the good fortune of helping a little bit one day. So I got to do that for the first time and see how absolutely excruciatingly difficult it is to get one of these things into 4 meters of peat. So the results of that will be definitely telling, and as more of that study goes on. And then I'm still always working with Gabriel and Will on despite my distraction with the Iron Age, I'm still looking at the fell site and all that. Oh, but sorry, I didn't finish my thought. One thing I do want to do, which I kind of dropped those hints about Ouya, is I'd really like to see some geophys work out there, just to verify if there is still something in existence under the ground, because I think that would be worth exploring. The location is a tiny bit challenging, but since we have somebody in Scalawa who self-taught themselves how to use some of this equipment, it might not be a bad little place for him to practice some of those skills.
That's great, Steve. Has anyone got any last questions? I mean, it's really exciting stuff.
Mark's got a question.
Yeah, I'd fire one in if I could, please.
Go for it.
As a sort of wider interpretation of the areas, especially at Lang Clodie, in modern times, all those lochs are really productively trout. Some of which is stocked by the Anglers Association, but I'm fairly sure some of it's self-sustaining and a bit older. Is there any, given the sparse nature of the landscape and no access to the sea, is there any suggestion, any evidence that freshwater trout would have been part of their diet?
I don't know for that area in particular. I do know that in mainland Scotland, freshwater fish during the Iron Age is utilized from time to time. Seafood in general isn't utilized to any great degree. It doesn't make up a large part of the diet. But these things do change, and I'm a little fuzzy on this, but things do change as you get deeper into the sort of the end of the Iron Age. And you do start to see, you know, the let's just say the rise of Christianity, for example. But the taboo on seafood is fairly well established. In fact, I think we saw at St. Ninian's, I think there was evidence that seafood was often inferred to be used as a last resort, you know, during times of famine or starvation instead of a first choice food. It seems that cattle and especially for what we believe the wealthy, that pigs were the preferred source at that point in the Iron Age. So whether the Picts were in there fishing, it could be, I don't know. You know, it was one of the things that struck me with the Neolithic site, they had all the felsite artifacts spilling into the loch, as I was having a sandwich one day, just sitting lochside, and a fish of some size jumped out of this little loch. And I was quite surprised to see that there was a fish that size living in it. And that's probably, it wouldn't have been a stocked loch because it's not even a named loch, but the fish had been there. So I don't know.
I can't remember, annoyingly, I can't remember the details, but when I was down in Glasgow in 2018, I remember going to a talk on isotopic analysis, which was Pictish. And there was also a talk of, I mean, obviously it's not unusual for different status levels to have a different diet, but there was some talk of freshwater fish, I'm sure, in that at different levels of society. So I will try and see if I can dig out any notes on that, because I can't even remember who gave the talk. I was down there for the Vikings in Scotland conference and kind of piggybacked on a University of Glasgow talk that was going on. So I'll see if I can find notes. But there was something to do with status difference as well in fish.
Statinus, we've certainly got fish going right through the Iron Age, although they get kind of bigger as they go further offshore. Well, really, I suppose, as the Iron Age progresses, but really, once there comes to be a Viking influence, then they're going a lot further offshore and getting much bigger fish. But fish are there right through. That's sea fish, of course.
Possibly on a slighter side, there's a strain of trout out on the above the banks on Runners Hill there that's been isolated since the Ice Age and is genetically unique.
Very much confirms the fact that despite stocking, the abundance of trout has always been there. And you know, in angling circles, Birkelwater is legendary. Lang Clodie is quite prolific as well. Hevedale, maybe not quite so abundant, but it grows big fish as well. So for any people living there in older times, they'd have been seeing that in some cases quite relatively large fish right under their noses. It'd be hard to believe that they wouldn't think about eating them.
Possibly something to do with all the midges out there.
Or the bonksies. Well, is that it for questions? And nothing else?
I'll just check the chat. Hang on, see if we've got any new ones. No, I think that's everybody finished. A lot of people saying they've enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed it, and there'll be, as Val says, this is a huge contribution you're doing here. So this is really exciting stuff. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for turning up, and do feel free, if you think of something for Steve later on, feel free to email the Archaeology Shetland email address that you got the link from, or send us a message on Twitter or Facebook or something, and I'll pass it on to Steve. Just in case you get a burning question in the middle of the night, you need to know about Pictish houses.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, as Esther says, any questions, more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Steve.
Thank you very much, Steve.
All right, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.